communications projects in science, biotechnology, and healthcare industries. She plays a pivotal role in the change management and communications team at Gagan McDonald, currently supporting a global pharmaceutical company through its corporate integration and previously supporting this organization through during a global transformation. Her success includes launching an enterprise-wide leader engagement initiative that reached 1,600 plus employees and achieved a culture shift by implementing intentional leader listening and elevating employee feedback. With that, let's get started. Please feel free to use the chat feature as we collect questions, and we will try to answer them at the end of the presentation. Over to you, Malkia.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kalpana. Thank you, Oliver. Thank you, ATD Mid-New Jersey, for this invitation. And welcome, all of you. I appreciate you deciding to spend your lunch hour with us today. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation. 3 things that change everything, the building blocks of change. And before we actually jump in, I think I should mention, Kalpana did a great job introducing me. I typically work with clients that are implementing change across their organizations. Typically it's large scale with big impacts. So things like mergers and acquisitions, leadership transitions, sometimes geographic footprint changes. But I really want to assure you today that the framework that I'm going to share with you today is a framework that will work for any size change. So I don't want you to feel as though, this is only applicable within a certain size organization or with a certain size initiative. All right, my sincere hope today is that some information, insights, ideas, you'll be able to gather some things that you can take and carry forward with you in your work. So if we can move to the next slide, and you may have to click again. I want to take a quick poll because I just want to get a sense of who we have participating today. So if Oliver, you can bring up the question, I'd like you to let me know what percentage of your role is responsible for driving change. And so as you are answering that, I just want you to know it's not uncommon for many of our clients to come to us because they've been given an assignment to manage or lead a project, a change project, in addition to all of the other day-to-day responsibilities that they have. So if that's your situation, I just want to give you some encouragement that you're not alone. All right. So I'm going to take a look here at our results. It seems like the majority of you, 75% of you, that's the 75% of your role, I should say, is responsible for managing change. And that makes sense. That's why I guess you're here today. So I want to jump in, if we can move to the next slide, and let's just talk about context, please. Where is it that where are organizations finding themselves today? If you take a look at this chart, this was research conducted by Deloitte. And Deloitte was studying the pace between technology, people, business, and public policy. And you can see from the chart that up through about the 1980s, until about the 1980s, we can go back. Okay, I'm not sure, is the graph showing? Let me know. Great, I think it is. You can see on the graph that up through about the 1980s, these groups were pretty much working in parallel with one another. And it was in the 1980s, however, that we saw this tremendous shift in technology. Technology began this uptick. And so that's where we saw this space happen between technology, people, business, and public policy. You can note that people have done a fairly decent job with keeping up with the pace of technology. Businesses, so-so. Public policy is lagging. But it's in that space that appears between technology and people, that's where disruption happens. So when I say disruption, what do I mean? I'm actually referring to those companies or technologies or ways of thinking and working that have completely overturned traditional modes of business. So think of your Netflix, think of your Airbnbs, think of your Ubers. And so we are now in this era of disruption where it's not an exception anymore. It's actually the norm, it's actually the rule. And our companies are operating in this constant state of change and flux. So much so that there are some trends that we can see that we've noted. So one of them is gone are the 10-year strategic plans. Gone. I don't know if you've seen them. I haven't seen them in quite some time. And I don't even know if I've seen a 5-year strategic plan, to be honest with you. It is just that difficult because companies are trying their best to keep up. You just can't project that far ahead any longer. Another trend in this era that we're seeing is the alignment between consumer spend habits and personal values. So what do I mean? I mean, consumers are actually buying based on their personal values, and they're pressuring organizations to basically say where they stand. So companies are having to make public statements where they stand on certain, social issues because consumers are demanding it. And another trend that I'll just point out is the line that used to exist between internal and external is blurred, if not completely disappeared altogether. What do I mean? So, corporate reputation, let's take that for an example. Corporate reputation used to be primarily an externally focused function. But now, with the proliferation of social media, with the uptick of employee activism, corporate reputation has to be internal and external. That was never the case before. So as I said, we are in this space now, our companies are in this space of constant and perpetual change. And I want to just put a finer point on it, if we can move to the next slide. If you take a look at the next slide, Gartner did a little research where they looked at companies that were undergoing business transformation, and they basically found out that every large organization that participated in that survey indicated that they had either undergone or they were in the process of undergoing an enterprise-wide transformation, and they had done so 5 times in the prior 3 years. And out of those executives that participated in that survey, they indicated that they expected that number to rise. So if you think about that, 5 enterprise-wide, so these are wide-scale transformations in 3 years or less, only to expect that that number is going to increase. This scale and this pace of change is like whiplash. It's having real impact on organizational health. It's having real impact on employee experience. So, and that's where Gagan comes in, because we focus on executing change through employee experience. So we did a study 2 years ago. We can go to the next slide. About 2 years ago, we were at the conference board in New York, yes. And we are a sponsor. They have an annual change and transformation conference. And we decided 2 years ago, it was June, we decided to take a pulse of the change leaders who were there and ask them what their common concern was, their top concern with regards to executing change initiatives. What they indicated, more than half of them, indicated that their primary concern was employee change fatigue. That employees were becoming just worn out by the scale and the frequency of change, and it was posing a real risk. So now let's fast forward 2 years. We at Gagan, we administered another diagnostic, not with the same people, but we administered a diagnostic this past May because we wanted to find out what impact the pandemic was having on transformation and change initiatives. What we learned is many respondents let us know that the pandemic was actually causing them to accelerate their change initiatives, that they were actually speeding up their timelines when it came to executing on new ways of working or executing on new business models. Another portion of our respondents, however, indicated that the pandemic actually had put them in survival mode. And as a result, they were going to have to start planning for downsizing. So what's noteworthy here is no matter what camp the respondents found themselves in, majority of them still indicated that the top concern was employee experience. So whether they were planning on full steam ahead, charging ahead, accelerating the change, or if they were looking to pull back, their top concern was still employee experience. So the reason why this is important is because it's humans that execute change initiatives. And if humans are fatigued, and as the pandemic is showing us in so many other ways, the pandemic is simply exacerbating something that's already existing. The pandemic is actually causing now employees to be just burned out. So let me hear from you. If we can take another poll, I want to know from you, what is your top concern when it comes to executing change initiatives? Oliver, if you could bring our poll up. It's actually our second poll. I think it's important that we think about the impact of change fatigue, the impact that it's having on our employees. Because as I mentioned, change is a human struggle. We need employees, we need humans to execute on it. And so it's important that we get a real good sense for how employees are experiencing the change. Many times our change approaches are really coming from a very methodical project management point of view. And what that misses is that human factor. Unfortunately, I'm trying to see your results and I don't know where that screen has gone. Do we have those results, Oliver? All right, perhaps we don't. Okay, great. All right, so now the majority of you are saying that your top concern is sustaining organizational energy, momentum, right? That makes sense. Navigating change fatigue, yeah, that makes sense. And that's in line with research that we've conducted. And when you think about energy, energy falls within that same space of change fatigue because it all has to do with how employees are experiencing the organization. And that energy is also critical, keeping employees buoyant, keeping them motivated. That's all a part of the experience. So let's get started because I want you to know that despite these circumstances, despite the rapid pace of change, despite the never-ending pendulum that employees are finding themselves on, we at Gagan posit that there are three things that when done consistently well, they can have a very real impact on your change efforts. If we can move to the next slide. So at Gagan, we believe there are three things. Next slide, perfect. We believe there are three things, as I said, three things that are interdependent, but when they work together and they're done well and done consistently over time, we've seen with our experience working with clients over the past 20 years, we've seen these have significant success in moving change projects forward and meeting objectives. Those three things are a compelling story, committed leaders, and an intentional roadmap. And I'm going to cover off on each one, and we'll also cover a few activation ideas. So let's get started with compelling story. Next slide, please. So compelling story, what is that? Typically, many organizations refer to this as the narrative, and that is what it is. We use the term interchangeably. A compelling story really should be the bedrock of any organization. meaning that it should frame the organization's purpose, its reason for being. What a compelling story does is it highlights what the challenges are that are facing the organization, but it aspirationally points to the opportunities ahead. The compelling story, think of it as like a campfire. It's the thing that draws everyone together. It's the unifier. And so what's the value here? The value is that the compelling story has the potential of creating an emotional connection between employees and that larger goal. You see, so when employees can see themselves as part of that larger story, as part of the purpose, employees are more likely to opt in to change instead of opting out. So, as I said, many people have a narrative, but there's something that we typically see and often see as missing from the narrative. Typically, the missed opportunity with a narrative is that it's not active and it's not evergreen. So a compelling story, when I say it's not active, what am I saying? A compelling story should actually be woven throughout the employee experience. So every touch point that that employee has should have a piece of the compelling story there. When I say a compelling story should be evergreen, what I mean is an organization is typically not static. It's typically evolving. The compelling story should also be evolving. And so that's a watch out. As I said, many companies that we've worked with over the years, we find that that's typically where they fall a little short when it comes to building out their narrative and making it as powerful and as impactful, perhaps not as they could, just simply because it's not active and it's not evergreen. All right, what's our next building block? Committed leaders. Next slide. So committed leaders, we all know how essential, how critical leaders are to driving change, right? Leaders are the bridge between the strategic objectives and the employees. And having committed leaders is so essential because committed leaders are able, by virtue of them having the trust factor, employees trust them, employees look to them for guidance, for inspiration. By having that role and responsibility, excuse me, leaders have the ability to connect dots. So they can help an employee understand how their day-to-day ties and connects to decisions that the company is making and the path that the company is on. But what does that look like? What do committed leaders look like? Committed leaders are aligned. They're aligned on the strategic objectives. They've aligned to them. They are in agreement with the direction. Secondly, committed leaders are well aware of their accountabilities. They understand what's being asked of them. They understand their roles. They understand what's required of them. And thirdly, committed leaders are simply just really good people managers. They lead with authenticity. They are transparent, they're visible. So when you have leaders that are strong, they are able to carry that narrative. They're able, as I said, to connect the dots for employees and make the changes real. So now let's talk about our third and our final building block, intentional roadmap. Next slide, please. So, if there's anybody here that's as old as I am, you will remember maps before GPS. And when you use a physical map, the beauty of it is even if you were going to an unknown destination, on a map, you could see your route. You can see here are some landmarks that you'll pass. You can estimate the distance and the time that it's going to take for you to get to your destination. And so if you're like me, going to an unknown place can sometimes be a little scary and maybe produce a little anxiety. A map kind of calms and gives a sense of assurance that you will get to your destination. So when it comes to employee experience, an intentional roadmap works very much the same way. The intentional roadmap is what shows where the company is now, where it's going, the points in between, and what it's going to take. An intentional roadmap helps employees understand what it's going to take to get to the destination. What new behaviors do they need to start exemplifying? What new processes will be rolled out? The other thing that an intentional roadmap does, and this is one of my favorite aspects of this, is it provides an opportunity for an organization to do a little show and tell. So think of success stories. A success story is powerful because it's able to provide employees with real-world testimonials from fellow colleagues or from leaders across the organization, where they are able to tell their story in their own words of how the change is benefiting them, or what new process or new structure are they working in that's paying off and paying dividends for their teams or for them individually, and how this is all working together for the advancement of the company. So that's what an intentional roadmap does. It basically shows and showcases, this is why the change is a good thing, and this is how the change is going to be in our best interest. So those are the three things. In a nutshell, very simple, compelling story, committed leaders, intentional roadmap, not very complicated, but you may be saying, well, okay, Malkia, that's great. You're pushing for those three things, but what happens if you don't have them? And that's a valid question. So I think it's something we want to just touch on and have a little time on that. What happens if you don't have all three? So let's advance to the next slide and we can talk about that. So if you don't have one of the elements, this chart here is designed to show scenarios in which we're missing an element and to showcase what it is that we've seen happen in our experience working with clients over the past 20 years. What have we seen happen when one of the elements is missing? So the first scenario, as indicated by the first row, we're missing an intentional roadmap. Okay. When you're missing an intentional roadmap, what you will typically see happen in an organization is employees are left to themselves to figure out future state. And so they're filling in the blanks with what they think maybe the future state is, but they're not really sure. And so what this can oftentimes produce for employees is a sense of frustration, because not only are they having to come up with what maybe they think the future state is, but also there's a sense sometimes of spinning their wheels, kind of like, all right, I'm being asked to do all these new things, but I don't know why. I don't know what it's for. I don't understand where we're going with this. And so it can cause a lot of swirl in an organization. And that's what we've seen over the last 20 years when an intentional roadmap is missing. So let's look at that second row. What's missing there is committed leaders. Now, I'm going to be very honest with you. When you're missing committed leaders, it is very difficult to get a change initiative off the ground. And that's because all the reasons that I mentioned earlier. Leaders are the bridge, right? Leaders are the ones that they connect the larger strategic objective to the employee. And when they're good and strong, they can connect the dots for employees. They can help employees understand and translate how their everyday work supports the larger goals. So if you don't have that, if you don't have committed leaders, it's going to be very challenging to fill that space, to be that bridge, right? And what typically happens in that scenario is you have a change management plan that's just that. It's just a plan. You don't ever really get into execution mode without committed leaders. So now our third scenario, that third row is showing we're missing a compelling story. So without the compelling story, remember, the compelling story gives the purpose, the organizational purpose. It's that campfire. It's the unifier, right? It draws everyone and brings everyone together. It has the potential, when it's done well and when it's strong, it can create that emotional connection for employees. So when you're missing a compelling story, and many times organizations will have a narrative, but it's not compelling. So if you're missing that compelling narrative, what happens is employees sometimes start to say, well, maybe I don't have a place here any longer. I don't really see myself as part of this organization's future. I can't really see myself where I fit in here. And when employees start to ask those types of questions, that can lead to disengagement, and disengagement can produce a whole nother host of risks. So hopefully this helps you see, or just gives you just a bit of understanding that this is why we push so strongly at Gagan and believe so strongly, just from experience and working with clients, that these three elements really are interdependent. They work together, and they work together in such a way that they actually serve as fuel for the change initiatives. So now I want to just pivot a little bit and talk about activation. If we can move to the next slide. So here are some suggested ideas. I'm not going to cover off on all of them. I think it's fairly self-explanatory here, but there are a few that I just want to highlight and touch on. These are ideas that, based on our work with clients, that we've seen to be pretty successful when they are executing on the three things. So one of them is stories, excuse me. And I mentioned them earlier, and I just want to reiterate, because stories are extremely popular and they can be very effective. I just want to highlight again that when employees can see their fellow colleagues and they can see leaders from across the organization give their testimonials on how the change is working for them, working well for them, enhancing how their teams are performing, this serves as motivation. So let's go back. Many of you indicated that your top concern is maintaining organizational energy. And so I would, ask, do you have something like employee stories or testimonials in the mix where, like I said, it can serve as a source of motivation to showcase how things are going well for people in the organization as a result of the change. Another activation idea that I'll just call your attention to is a journey map. Journey maps are wildly successful simply because they're visually engaging. They tend to be visually engaging. As I talked about earlier, that intentional roadmap is great because it helps employees see where the organization is now, where it's going, the points in between, what is it going to take to get there. And visualizing, having that visualization is not only engaging for that reason, but also it's a tool that you can now give to your leaders to put in their arsenal. So remember, committed leaders, one of the ways that committed leaders and ways it happens is when leaders have they're equipped, right? They're equipped with the knowledge of the changes, they're in alignment with the changes, but they can confidently speak to what's happening in the organization. And this is a tool, a journey map is a tool that leaders can start using. They can put it into their presentations, or they can use a journey map as a standalone, but they can take it with them as they start having conversations throughout the organization. And the last thing that I'll just mention here as an activation idea is a change assessment, a culture assessment, excuse me. So we at Gagan really feel very strongly about the power of culture assessment. And the reason we feel really strongly about it is because a lot of times organizations may set out for a certain future state. However, they find out that their culture doesn't support that state. So what do I mean? So an organization may say and may decide that, for future state, we need to become an innovative organization. We need to be risk takers, right? That may be future state. However, their current culture is a risk adverse culture, meaning the mindsets, the behaviors, the practices in the organization don't exactly align with that future state. And so when you have that misalignment, that's what makes achieving the goals of a change initiative, that's what makes it very difficult. And so that's why we really strongly recommend that our clients assess their culture. You want to get a sense of what behaviors, what mindsets are going to help, and what mindsets, I can't talk, what mindsets are, I just said it again, what mindsets are going to potentially hinder the change initiative. And all of that can be seen through a culture assessment. So with that pretty much concludes the content portion, things that I wanted to share with you. And I'm just really eager now to open things up and just start hearing from you. I want us to be able to have some cross-pollination of ideas. I want to know what's working in your organizations, what questions you have.
Thank you, Malkia. That was excellent. We covered a lot of very interesting and thought-provoking points there. We do have a